All right, good morning. Today we begin our Lenten series here at Awaken as we move toward resurrection. The title of this sermon is The Temptation of Being Human. Now, as we've spoken a bit about, Lent is this 40-day period leading up to Easter, to Resurrection Sunday, and Lent is a season. And if you've been with us at Awaken for a while, we talk about this every year, but this is this intentional season, and we need it, I need it every single year, an intentional time to reflect on our lives, reflect on that which we are carrying around within us, because sometimes you go through a year, you don't realize how much gunk has accumulated within your soul. You ever notice that? You pause for a moment and you're like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that was there. So we need this season of Lent to reflect, to peer under the hood. It's a season of purging, of cleansing. Instead of a juice detox, we do a soul detox during Lent. I think it's an intentional time of silence as well. I think silence is very, very important for this season. There's so much noise in life. We have so much noise around us that we need to intentionally silence not only ourselves, but also the external noise that's constantly around us. It's a season of repentance, which means to turn. You're walking one path and you realize, oh, this isn't the best path for me. This path isn't leading to life. So you repent, you turn 180 degrees and you begin walking in a new direction. So it's this invitation that we are being offered to analyze, inspect, reflect on our lives and ask, is there anything not serving me well? Is there anything that needs to die within me? Anything that needs to be put to rest that I need to leave behind so that 6 weeks from now, 40 days from now, I can experience the fullness of the resurrection? And that's what we are going for here at Awaken. It's what we go for every single year. A couple of years, what I've done is I've handed out seeds to everyone and then dirt. And how does a seed grow? You have to bury it in the dirt. So the seed disappears for a while. You don't actually see it, but it's working under the surface. And I think that often that's how resurrection works. There's something bubbling up within us under the surface. You can't externally see it, but then boom, one day it's there. And there's growth and there's new life. And that's the hope of resurrection. But in order to get there, in order to get to new life and resurrection, unfortunately, you have to go through a death. And that's not the easiest, not the most comfortable. We don't like talking about that in our 21st century American culture. We like the big, we like the life, but to actually experience a death that brings us to new life, it makes us a bit uncomfortable. But that's what Lent is all about. And so I titled this series Lent 2025. Great title, right? Yeah. 40 days to a new you. Now, who wants to experience transformation in their life this season? Who could use some new? Who feels some lethargy, some heaviness, some weightiness within your soul? And your hope in this season is that you would emerge filled with buoyancy and new life and more hope and joy and a fullness that maybe you're not experiencing right now in this moment. That's my hope. That's my prayer for you this season of Lent. That 40 days from now, we'll look back and realize, I've been transformed. And there's some newness emerging within me that wasn't there before I started this journey. Now, as Elle had talked about this morning, the number 40, it is this highly symbolic number in the Bible. And what I am going to do for this series is each week I am going to take a different story in the Bible that highlights the number 40. So there's all these stories in the Bible that 40 is sort of the anchoring point. It's the foundation for the story. And 40 is just this symbol of a purging, of a cleansing. How many days was Noah in the ark for? 40 days. How many days was Moses on the mountain receiving 10 commandments? 40 days. So 40 shows up time and time again in Scripture. And what I want to do throughout the season of Lent is I want to look at these stories and ask, what does it mean for me? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for me today, 2025, as I sit in a movie theater and experience church? What does it mean for us as our hope, our desire is to receive the new life that Christ brings? And what 40 does, I mean, Lent is 40 days. I don't think it's a coincidence that you have all these stories of 40 in the Bible and then Lent happens to be 40 days because it's this time of preparation. And what these stories of 40 do, and I almost called the series Stories of 40, but I went with the more classic Lent 2025. But what these stories of 40 do is they communicate all the themes associated with Lent. So we're going to do a deep, deep dive into not only Lent, but 40 and how it has shown up in the Bible for hundreds, thousands, could we say, of years. So the number 40, it's been around for quite a while, and it's held this significance, this deep significance for many, many people, going back to very, very early ancient times. Now, we'll begin this week with the story of Jesus in the wilderness, because this is the opening salvo of Lent. All the Lent readings, they start here with Jesus in the wilderness, because how many days is he in the wilderness? All right, you're catching on. Good. If you've never read the story, I hope you could still have gotten that answer correct. Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days. He has done, at this point in the story, what has Jesus done? Do we know? Nothing. He's been baptized. Oh, he's been born. All right. But I mean, does he really participate in that? It's kind of just happened to him. You know, like your birth, it kind of just happened to you. You just happened like, oh, I'm here. So Jesus has done absolutely nothing at this point in the story. He's born. He has been baptized, and then immediately after his baptism, we read this. And we're going to look at Matthew's account because we're doing a Bible study on Matthew. So even though this story shows up in Luke, I thought, well, since we're talking about Matthew, we might as well look at the details of this wilderness experience within the book of Matthew. So Matthew 4, verse 1. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. All right, let's pause here a moment because this is packed full of details and information for us to do a little dive into. First, what we are told, Jesus is led into the wilderness, into the desert by whom? By the Spirit, which tells us that this movement, this invitation, this is God ordained. Jesus going into the wilderness, it's not of his own initiative. He didn't wake up one morning, he didn't get baptized like, oh, let me go into the desert for a bit just to kind of hang out so I can get some space and solitude and silence before I begin having a public ministry. But rather, this is something that God was leading Jesus into. It also tells us that God was with him in this moment. Sometimes we think about our desert, our wilderness experiences, and it feels as if God is absent. You ever have one of those moments before in life? You find yourself in the wilderness, a dry period in your life, a painful period where it feels as if others might have abandoned you. So Jesus enters into the desert, but this is Spirit-led, which means even though he might feel as if he's been abandoned, even if he feels like he's alone or he's going through a difficult moment in life, this tells us that God is still with him in all those moments. And the invitation that God is offering Jesus, because remember, Jesus is 100% fully human, fully God, but also fully human. And the invitation as he enters into the desert, into the wilderness, is to be tempted, to be tested is another way in which we could translate this. How many of you like to be tested? I didn't think so. Whether it's a test that you take in school or a trial that you're going through in life, it doesn't feel comfortable. We do not like these moments. Maybe you'll look back on a moment of testing and you'll realize the significance of it. You'll realize how you were transformed by it. But in the moment, I mean, would anyone sign up for this? No. Now, in the Greco-Roman world, which is the world in which Jesus was living, testing was a common concept. So everyone reading this story in its original context, in the original audience, oh, testing, yeah, well, of course this is what happens. It was a common concept, whether in the context of education, military, or philosophy. Testing was seen as a means to prove the worth or the capability of an individual. In the Jewish tradition, testing by God was understood as a way to refine and purify faith. Now, this seems odd, does it not? Because you think about Jesus, and you think, well, Jesus is fully God. Why would his faith need to be refined? Why would Jesus' faith need to be purified? Unless this is setting an example for us in our humanity. This testing has to do with the fully 100% human side of Jesus, which is a model for us in our humanity. Now, tempted, tested, it can be translated to try, to make a trial of, test for the purpose of ascertaining his quality. And then here's what I love, and here's what I want you to remember about testing. What he thinks or how he will behave himself. This testing, these 40 days in the wilderness, in the desert, it was to draw out what Jesus thinks about himself, how Jesus will conduct his life, how he will lead his ministry, the foundation that he will build his life upon. This is preparation as he goes out and fulfills this invitation that God has for his life. Jesus being fully human, I think he could have said no to it. He could have said no, and so he enters into the wilderness, this moment of testing, of purifying, of refining, in order to determine, well, this is what I will build my life upon. And we all have a foundation upon which we're building our lives. Lent is a time for us to reflect on that foundation. What do we believe about ourselves? What are the stories, the dominant stories we're carrying around within our head that is building our life? What's the foundation that we are building upon? Then the story continues. Jesus led by the Spirit, wilderness, after fasting. And I love this line right here. I mean, this is one of those that if it doesn't make you laugh, you're not reading the Bible well. Because think about this. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, what? He was, come on, of course. Do we really need that detail? I love it. I mean, think about it. 4 days, 4 nights, and then, of course, you're going to be, you ever tried this before? You're like, oh my goodness, I am ravenous. Yeah, of course he's hungry. Then the tempter came to him and said, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. Jesus answered, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then, second temptation. The devil took him to the holy city, had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you. They will lift you up in their hands. There's no kryptonite here. So that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Jesus answered him, it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Again, and I love the usage of test right there because it's like, well, who's being tested? Jesus or God? Now again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you if you will bow down and worship me. And Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left him and angels came and attended him. Now, let's talk about those first two temptations. If you noticed as we were reading these temptations, the temptations begin with this disclaimer. If you are the Son of God. If this is who you believe you are, well then go and do this. If this is what you believe to be your identity, well then, of course, you're going to be able to rely on God to perform the miraculous for you. What exactly is the significance of this, I guess, questioning? If you are the Son of God, what's the significance of it? Remember how I said Jesus was baptized. This is one of the only things he's done up until this point that the gospel writers tell us. He's been baptized, and then immediately after his baptism, he goes into the wilderness, desert, yes. Now, let's read the baptism because this is very, very important for understanding exactly what's happening here. This is Matthew chapter 3. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened. He saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Side note here. The love of God is being proclaimed upon Jesus. Worth and value is being proclaimed upon Jesus. And yet at this point in the story, it's as if he hasn't done anything to earn that. It's just intrinsic to who he is. Sometimes we think that we have to work really, really hard. We have to prove ourselves, prove our value, our worth. We have to prove that we are loved, whether for others, for ourselves, or for God. But what we find right here is that God's love, the immense worth and value that God sees in you, it's yours. You don't have to go chasing for it. There's nothing you need to do to earn it. That love is yours simply because you are alive. And so this voice from heaven says, well, this is my Son. And then we get to these temptations which say, if you are the Son of God, in other words, everything that has just been proclaimed upon Jesus, well, now the tempter, the devil, is saying, well, if you are the Son of God, if you truly believe what was said and spoken about you. See, this for Jesus raises all sorts of questions like, well, will he trust what God has spoken over him? Will he trust that he truly is the Son of God? This voice that was spoken as he emerged out of his baptism, will he trust that that is his truest identity? Or what about this? Will he live from his God-given identity, or will he try to manufacture an identity of his own making? You ever been there before? You're trying really, really hard to be a particular person, and it just feels like all this work. Will Jesus trust this God-given innate identity, or will he burn himself out by working really, really hard in order to make something of himself? Will Jesus believe himself worthy of the life that God is inviting him into? Before he goes and begins his public ministry, there's all these questions circling around Jesus. Will he trust that he is worthy of the mission, the task, the life before him? For Jesus, these 40 days in the desert, they serve as a time of examining his inner world, questioning, preparing, and also, I would say, choosing which truths will serve as the foundation of his life. Have you ever noticed this before? The truths that you choose to believe in, well, they can lead you into life or they can lead you to a dead end. It's very, very important which truths we choose to place our trust and our faith in. This is what Jesus was doing in the desert. Now, I'm reading this book. It's called Forever Strong, a new science-based strategy for aging well. And of course, I found sermon material in this book, which, right, just makes perfect sense, does it not? Now, in the book, The author mentions something called the upper limit problem. And it comes from another book called The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks. And here's what we're told about the upper limit problem. In his book, he explains, Hendricks, we all have a threshold for feeling good, how much health improvement we feel worthy of attaining. We all have this upper limit problem. Now, this might pertain to health, but I would argue that it pertains to all of life. We all have this upper limit that determines how worthy we believe ourselves to be of receiving whatever it happens to be. How worthy we are of receiving love, acceptance. How worthy we are of achieving certain things in life. This upper limit, well, it limits us. It tells us this is how far as we can go, but we can't break beyond that limit. Well, I think I'm this worthy of receiving love, and maybe it's like 33%. But because you have this upper limit problem, it stops there. Well, I could never receive the love that I truly desire because, well, I'm not deserving of it. I've blown too many relationships. I've made too many mistakes. Or we might think, well, sure, I can receive a portion of God's forgiveness, but never the whole amount because, well, I've just, man, if others were to know, if God were to know where I've been, what I've done, well, I could never receive the full forgiveness of God. This upper limit problem, it restricts us. It's a restricted sense of self that limits you from fully living into the fullness of your potential, the full worth of who God has created you to be. And so because of this upper limit problem, and we all have a different threshold, what happens is we carry around these faulty or deflating inner messages that hold us down, that suppress us, that keep us from risking, from trusting, from stepping out into something because we think, well, that's for other people, but it's really not for me. So we have this upper limit, this threshold that tells us, well, we're only worthy of receiving this much, but the other worthiness, well, that's for someone who's better than me. If you are the Son of God, what's happening here is Jesus' upper limit is being questioned. You ever find yourself there before? And we're told that if you are the Son of God, it's spoken by who? By the devil. A few other ways in which we could translate devil: deceiver, liar, accuser, sower of doubt, an upper limit enforcer. I love that one. A distorter of your true identity. These temptations force Jesus, and I would argue us, as we read the story and enter into the story, to examine the internal messages we're choosing to trust and the foundation we're building our lives upon. Are there any lies that we're carrying around within us? Any messages that are distorting the true identity, the true person that God sees when God sees you? Any messages that are accusing you, that are distorting the truth of your endless worth, this boundless love and grace that God has upon you. If you're worthy, if you're valued, if you're truly loved, if you're forgiven, if you're accepted. Anyone else, you feel like there's some deceiving voices within your head that are holding you down and taking you away from the fullness of life that God desires for you. See, what we discover in this story is that once Jesus embraces the truth that he is the Son of God, once he says, yes, this is my identity, this is what was spoken over me, and I will choose to trust this message, he now has the Spirit power to resist the temptations presented to him. But the resistance, the ability to stand up to these temptations, it all came about because he chose to trust the truest message about himself. When we think about our lives, when we think about the trials, the temptations, the testings that we face, the only way that we will stand up to these temptations, that we will withstand them, is by choosing to trust the message of God that is spoken over you. You're loved. You're worthy. You're valued. You're accepted, and not for what you've done, not for how much value you've given to the world, but simply because you're breathing, and you're here, and you're alive, and that value and worth is intrinsic to who you are, and there's nothing you need to do to earn it. There's no way you could earn more worth or value, because the truth is, it's already yours. But unfortunately, life tries to beat that out of us because there's deceiving voices, and there's accusing voices, and there's messages and noise that distorts the truth of those messages. Now, let's look at these three specific temptations. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "Well, it's written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Man doesn't live on bread, and I love that word, alone. What Jesus is saying here, as he resists this temptation, he says, we're more than just the physical. There's more going on within us and around us than just that which you can taste, touch, and feel. When we focus on the physical, life becomes all about accumulating. It becomes all about possessions and trying to prove or earn our worth, our value by how much we have. But what Jesus is saying here is, well, there's way more than the physical that you can see and that you can touch. Life is about way more than that. Life is also about the inner messaging that you carry around. If your life is built on possessions and that which you can taste, touch, and feel, well, you're going to have a faulty foundation. Because what Jesus says is, yeah, the physical matters. Like, we need food, clothing, housing. Of course that matters. But there's also this spiritual component that you have within you as well. This mental, this emotional component too. And if you get that inner messaging wrong, well, it doesn't matter how much you've accumulated. It doesn't matter how much you have, because it's never going to be enough for you. And so getting that inner messaging right, notice every word from the mouth of God. What does God speak over us? You're loved. You're accepted. You're forgiven. Grace is upon you. If we distort those truths and those messages, it doesn't matter how much you can accumulate. Because there's some ways of living, as we've alluded to, that lead to life, and some ways that lead to death. You get that inner messaging wrong, it doesn't matter how much you have, your life can still feel like a living hell. And I'm sure you know stories of people who they seem to have it all, but they're miserable. And then there's plenty of other people who don't have as much, and yet they exude this sense of peace within them. Because there's something about the messages within them, the messages that they're building their lives upon. Second temptation, the devil took him to the holy city, had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down. It's written, he will command his angels concerning you. They will lift you up in their hands. You will not strike your foot against a stone. Jesus answered him, it's also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. This temptation is about how Jesus will conduct his ministry. Will he be about a religion of the show, the spectacular, the big moments, the moments that everyone is looking at, those memes, the reels that go viral? Will he build his life and his ministry on those moments, or will his religion and his life be built on the everyday, the ordinary, the moments when no one is looking, when no one sees that public persona that you have created for yourself? There is someone that I know on Instagram. They're a public persona. They have a lot of followers. I happen to know this person, and I have been in the presence of this person multiple times. Whenever this person is on Instagram creating a video, whenever they're in front of other people, they have a very engaging, loving, particular way of being. And this was the only interaction that I'd ever had with this person. And I'm like, oh, this is amazing. This person's great. Now, after having known this person for a while, one day I happened to be driving on a 2-lane, well, I guess it's a 4-lane, but 2 lanes going north on a parkway. And there was a car that was going slow in the right lane, so I turned into the left lane in order to pass this car. All of a sudden, out of my rear view mirror, I noticed there was this massive truck that was speeding up and started tailgating me because apparently I wasn't passing this person fast enough. Eventually, I ended up passing that slow-moving car on the right. But as I was doing so, I noticed the person behind me driving this truck was getting extremely agitated. I was like, my goodness, buddy, can't you just wait like another 30 seconds? And then you can go off to wherever you happen to be going to. I merged to the right lane after I had safe distance between me and the car in the right-hand lane. As I merged and as this other truck began passing me and flying by me, I noticed that they were waving a particular finger at me as they passed. As I looked, and I'm sure you can guess which one, it wasn't the thumb. As this person passed, it was a shocker because I said, oh my goodness, I know that person. That's the person who is so engaging and kind on Instagram. Is our life built on those public moments in front of others, the spectacular? And we're not actually building our character in the quiet moments, the personal moments when no one is watching? This was the temptation of Jesus. Throw yourself, everyone will see that you're the Son of God. Everyone will follow you. Jesus resisted because he said, well, I'm not just about a religion of show, but rather I'm about a religion of the everyday. The moments of being kind when the video camera isn't on. The moments of showing mercy and love and grace to those who maybe others don't think deserve it, but that's the kind of God that I am talking about and leading others to follow. Jesus said, I'm not going to be about the miraculous and the big show and the lights and everything, but rather I am going to be about the true character of God that shows up in the everyday, normal, ordinary moments of life. And then we come to the third temptation. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan. It's written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. We become like the God or the gods that we worship. Jesus, worship God only. Yeah, this tempter wanted Jesus to worship power, greed, more, ego, self. And Jesus says, well, that's not true worship. But rather, Jesus says, worship God alone, a God of love, of mercy, of concern for all people. We will become like the gods that we worship. What are we worshiping with our lives? We worshiping power, ourselves. We worshiping this God of love and grace and mercy for all people. Now, what I want to do here this morning as we close, as we end our service, is I want to read a story for you that has changed me and changed how I see God and Jesus. It's a modern day parable, and it's about transformation and what truly transforms. And I think it is so important for us to get this one right, because this is the foundation upon which our religion and our life is based on. And so I want to read this story, and as I do, we're going to close. Elle will come up, we'll sing another song, and then I want us to celebrate Eucharist or communion together. This reminder about a God of self-emptying love. Not a God who is out to receive more and more and more, but rather a God who gives away and realizes that true life comes as we give of ourselves. This example, the model that we see enacted in Jesus. So I want to read this story. We're going to sing a song. We'll celebrate communion together. The story comes from a book called The Orthodox Heretic. Love the title of that one. There was once a young man called Caleb who was obsessed with gathering up possessions and gaining status. He was so driven by the desire to succeed that from an early age he managed to become one of the most prominent and influential figures in the city. Yet he was not happy with his lot. He worked long hours, rarely saw his children, and often became irritable at the slightest problem. But more than this, he knew his lifestyle met with his father's disapproval. His father had himself been a wealthy and influential man in his youth, but he found such a life shallow and unsatisfactory. As a result, he had turned away from it in an endeavor to embrace a life of simplicity, fellowship, and meditation. Caleb's father had taught him from an early age about the problems that come from seeking material and political influence. And he wanted Caleb in the strongest possible way to embrace a life that delves deeply into the beauty of creation, the warmth of friendship, and the inspiration derived from deep and sustained reflection. Caleb's father was an inspiring man, well loved by all, and Caleb could see that his father, while living in a modest way, was at peace with himself and the world in a manner that his friends and colleagues were not. Because of this, Caleb often looked with longing at his father's lifestyle and frequently detested the path that he had personally chosen. Yet, despite this, he was still driven to pursue wealth and power. It was true that his father was a happy and contented man, but he was also concerned about his son. And on any occasion when they spent time together, he would criticize Caleb for the life he had chosen. But one day, while Caleb's father was reflecting upon his son's life, a voice from heaven interrupted him, saying, "Caleb is also my son, and I love him just the way he is. Caleb's father began to weep as he realized all these years he had been hurting his son through his disapproval and criticism. So he immediately visited his son's house and offered a heartfelt apology, saying, "Please, never feel that you have to change what you do or who you are. I love you without limit and condition, just as you are." After that day, the father began to take an interest in his son's life again, asking questions about what he was doing and how his work was progressing. But increasingly, Caleb found that he was no longer so interested in working the long hours. Soon, he started to skip work in order to spend more time with his family and began to take less interest in what others thought about him. Eventually, Caleb gave up his work entirely and followed in his father's footsteps, realizing it was only after his father had accepted him unconditionally for who he was that he was able to change and become who he had always wanted to be. The commentary on this: Jesus' understanding of forgiveness was so radical because he did not need people to repent before he would accept them. He did not require a change in their behavior before he loved, respected, and related to them. Yet it was precisely this unconditional love and forgiveness that seems so potent and transformative, often being the very act that drew people to repentance, a word that means to have a change of heart. To the person who says, "I've tried so hard to change, but can't," Jesus' response seemed to be, "It's okay. I love you and accept you just the way you are." Paradoxically, it's only when this message is taken to heart, if you're worthy, you're loved, valued, accepted, forgiven. It's only when this message is taken to heart, when it's trusted in, when it's believed, that real change and transformation can take place. So as you come forward this morning, as you take the bread, as you take the cup, and you remember the love of Christ that was poured out for you, your healing, your forgiveness, may you trust in a fresh way that you are loved. May you feel it. May you know it this morning in a new and powerful way, wherever you happen to be this morning. Whatever you might believe about yourself, whatever others might be saying about you, may you set that to the side. And may the foundation of your life be built upon how much you are loved, valued, and worth.